We also, as we sort of grow up in this country and we vote in all sorts of lesser elections, the principle of majority rule seems to prevail in virtually every other election. I don't understand why at this point in time we continue to adhere to a system that, again, undermines, in my view, the principle of political equality and simply doesn't follow the straightforward logic of majority rule.
The trouble with the word democracy is it means lots of different things to lots of different people. When the founders talked about democracy, they thought of a bunch of people getting together and voting on stuff. When people talk about it today, they often use it for what founders would have talked about as a republic.
So when the founders were creating our country, they had several examples to look back to in the past of places where the public ruled. And those places were primarily in antiquity, Greece. And there, the public ruled directly by making decisions collectively. Of course, that was impossible in an extended republic like ours, to bring all of the American citizens together, even at that early stage. So they understood that we needed a republican form of government. And what they meant by that was a representative form of government, where the will of the people is translated through elected officers. They wanted the public will to be refined and enlarged through our representatives. They not only thought a democracy would be impossible in this extended republic, but also unwise.
I mean, ultimately, you have to decide, do you value democracy or do you value individual rights?
And so it's always majority rule, minority right. If everything is simply 51%, then that gives me an interest to just get my 51%, make that as less diverse as possible so that I can actually govern and ignore you 49% of everybody else.
The notion that the country is ruled by the majority is a fiction. The biggest problem that the framers had to deal with was the difficulty that basically we don't all get along in the sense that we have different interests. Once people have liberty, they will tend to fragment. And that's the problem. The question is, what do you do about them? And there are two ways to deal with it. One, you try to get rid of them, which they do in tyrannical countries, despotic countries, or you adopt the solution that our framers adopted, and that was you divide and conquer. What you make sure is that you have many factions, not just a majority faction and a minority faction. When you say 50% plus one, you're referring to one big faction versus everybody else. But in this country, we have many, many factions. We try to multiply the factions. And the more we get, the less powerful any one is.
These are all very carefully crafted checks and balances that establish the idea that the majority generally should get its way in a number of areas, but we are going to have mechanisms that from time to time are going to frustrate the majority. We see that in Supreme Court rulings from time to time. We see that when the Senate is able to block legislation. Occasionally we see it in the election of the president. The majority generally gets its way in our federal republic, but not always.
The Constitution does not establish a democracy. The Constitution is about establishing self-government in a way that protects individual rights, which oftentimes is directly at odds with democracy. If what the majority of the people want in some particular moment is to interfere with the rights of a minority.
Well, the Constitution was set up to have varying degrees of the democratic process show up in different places. Most obviously, the election of the House. But also you see this in the delegation of power to state legislatures all through the Constitution, where the state legislatures can decide how to elect the electors, how to run an election, how to manage their own affairs. So the founders have a lot of democracy, if you will, in the election of the House, and they have little bits of democracy elsewhere, but it's also balanced with minority rights, and that's what makes the Constitution such a brilliant document.
Abraham Lincoln had to deal in 1858 with an opponent in the form of Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was a firm believer in democracy. He was so firm a believer that he believed that it was up to every citizen in every territory or every state to cast a majority vote for whether they wanted to have slavery or not slavery. He didn't inquire into the morality of slavery. He simply said that if a majority of the people in a given territory or a given state wanted to have slavery, then they could have it if that majority voted in favor of it. No further questions asked. For him, democracy was an end in itself. That's all you needed to ask. What did the majority want? In modern democracies, we sometimes talk a little carelessly in the tones of Stephen A. Douglas, that what matters is whether a 51% majority has endorsed something. And that is true up to a point. But there is a circle that is drawn around a set of rights. Rights that Jefferson talks about, rights that are articulated in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So we recognize that even in a democratic system, there are certain non-negotiables that majorities cannot pass on.
But we've been told that, well, as long as it's democratic, it's fine. That's a terrible idea. The most undemocratic part of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. I mean, the Bill of Rights is flatly anti-democracy because the Bill of Rights says, we don't care how big your majority is. You can't establish a national church. We don't care how big your majority is. You can't outlaw the press. We don't care how big your majority is. You can't turn to a private group that wants to influence politics and say, we're going to outlaw you meeting together. And these things will always be in conflict. Every American has to decide, do we value democracy more or do we value individual rights more? Historically, the answer in our Constitution is we value individual rights more than democracy. Democracy is a great process, but it's a process. It's not a purpose.